Welcome to Pre-Shift, tidbits of wisdom for everyday service. My name is TJ Griffin, and I'm the corporate wine educator for Winebow. We welcome your questions at any point. We encourage your questions at any point during the webinar, but please use the Q&A rather than the chat bar to submit them. Let me introduce your host, Master Sommelier Ron Edwards. Has almost 30 years of hospitality experience, and since 2018, he has been the Director of Wine Education for Winebow. And now, here to discuss today's topic, it's spring. Gru-Vee and Riesling, please. Master Sommelier Ron Edwards.
Good morning, TJ, and to all those out there in the audience. Nice to see some very familiar names on our list of attendees and a couple that maybe I haven't noticed before. So I'm glad to see we're reaching everybody we intend, plus maybe a couple more. All right, so let's talk about spring. Let's talk about why Gruner Veltliner and Riesling are something we need to be thinking about. Well, I think about them all the time, but certainly an opportunity for us in the restaurant and hospitality trade is spring, because it's a natural placeholder for this kind of wine alongside of many other things. So shall we start our journey, TJ?
I am ready.
All right. Well, hopefully everybody out there is ready as well. So let's talk about spring. You know, spring is a particular feeling. It's a sense. It's a timing issue. It's rejuvenation. It's rebirth. You know, it's vibrantly green and earthy flavors are abounding as life comes back after winter. Now, those of you who live in climates where winter means something different than those of us who actually have winter may feel differently about spring. But certainly, having lived in northern Michigan for a long time, I lived in western Pennsylvania for 5 or 6 years as a child. The emergence of spring is a really big deal. There's more light, there's warmer temperatures, everything starts turning green instead of white and brown. And it really is it's an emotional thing as well. And, you know, after a winter of relatively heavy flavors, root vegetables, meats, things that keep you warm and satisfied on cold winter nights, spring brings around the idea of refreshing, and it feels super attractive to think about things that are lighter, things that are more elevating to your palate and to your overall sense of well-being. And I feel like Gruner Veltliner and Riesling are perfect solutions to all of that. They're great with the vibrantly green and earthy flavor profiles of spring. They're also really elevating to the experience when you consume them. You have that very pure, racy sort of translation into your spirit, which I believe is exactly what you're looking for this time of year. So maybe that's a little too touchy-feely for some of you, but you know, wine for me is a very personal experience, and it's a personal experience that I really desire to share with other people. A great bottle of wine never tastes as good by yourself, and these are things that we share here at the house for sure. Gruner Veltliner's on our menu weekly. Riesling is on our menu weekly, and that's kind of like all year round, just because we love them. But this is a particularly poignant time to start introducing them to other people. And why are they potentially so attractive to people, and why can they fit so well into this time of year? And I think the key is this beautiful balance that they offer. Both of these grapes offer a beautiful balancing act. They have this magic of refreshing tartness and richness of flavor. And obviously there's a spectrum for both of these grapes, but in general, I think you can count on Riesling and Gruner Veltliner to offer you both of these things: refreshing tartness and richness of flavor. And what's also very interesting is, and not always associated with Riesling, but very true about Riesling, is that it's savory and fresh. And it is the essential element of why Gruner Veltliner is magic, is its savory side alongside of the freshness of the grape. Both of them have a cleansing nature with texture. And one of the things that starts to pop up into our menus and our consumption in spring and leading into summer is things like lemonade. Why is lemonade so attractive to us? Because it's both cleansing and it has a texture to it. And it's, well, once you put sugar in it, well, it's just magic, right? Because we can lie about how we feel about sugar all day long, and we can put down sugar as the evil of society, but we all crave sugar at one level or another. And if we didn't really love sugar so much, we wouldn't have put all this effort and time into creating fake sugar. or sugar substitutes. So let's not deny that in the reality of what we like to drink. And I've been to Starbucks. I see what people order. So the general everyday public, they love themselves some sugar. So, and it's a plus in a lot of applications. And especially when we're talking about Riesling and some of the wines having residual sugar, or the fruity styles, as we often call them now, out of Germany, they work with a different set of foods, and they are absolutely crushingly delicious. So, but why are they that? Because they're a beautiful balance, just like a great glass of lemonade. So let's talk about Riesling, Regal Riesling, as I call it. We tend to get wrapped up in the everyday wine world. And what I mean by that is the wine world that most of your neighbors are in, because those of you who are listening to me right now are probably in the trade, and we have a different view of wine because we're surrounded by it. We're in it all the time, both mentally and physically. And so we are used to things that are completely new to everybody else. Things that I consider to be a normal glass of wine to most of my neighbors. If they drink wine, they've never heard of it. Or if they drink wine, they wouldn't venture out to buy it on their own because they don't know what to do with it. And so that's what a lot of these conversations are about, is how do we get those people that live next door to us or down the street from us or come into our restaurants and our hotels on a regular basis who like wine, but just don't know what else is out there. How do we expand their realm a little bit? And today the goal is to expand their realm with Riesling and Gruner. So Regal Riesling, and this is a realistic interpretation of what the vine and the grape cluster looks like for classic Riesling. There's simple truths about this grape. One of the top 5 most noble grapes for wine, and that's red and white. And when you talk about nobility in grapes and what makes one of our grapes that we drink on a regular basis in the top tier, a lot of it boils down to how complex the wines are that are made from them, and how ageable they are, and last but not least, how well they translate a sense of place from where they were grown to you while you're drinking it. And I would say that Riesling is easily one of the top 5 of all grapes to do this. It's incredibly ageable. I have had the privilege of having Riesling in the 50 to 75 year range on a few occasions. And I know people who have had them in the 100-year-old range. And what's remarkable about this grape is even without a lot of alcohol, even without what we would consider weight and intensity in that regard, these wines age as well as any red wine on the planet. That's based on their acid balance, the tartness that comes to the conversation with Riesling from everywhere. And what's interesting about this is it's not just about German or Austrian Riesling that we get this ageability. When I was in Australia about 18 months ago, they opened up 30-year-old dry Riesling from Eden Valley for us, and it was stunning. And it came out of a screw cap. So, Riesling is just amazing. It also translates its sense of place. A Riesling grown in Eden Valley doesn't taste like a Riesling grown in the Wachau, which doesn't taste like a Riesling grown in Kremstal, which doesn't taste anything like a Riesling grown in the Mosel. That soil type, the overall climate that it's grown in, and just the nature of even the philosophy of winemaking where it's made is all clearly noted in a glass of Riesling. And I truly think that makes Riesling both cerebral and massively enjoyable. The other idea that really helps Riesling be noble is how well it just loves to be on the table with food. It is almost the best friend to anyone having a meal. I actually experimented with this. I had a bottle of J. Christopher Riesling, a Appassionata GG, open here at the house, and we happened to be having pot roast that night. And I had the option of a Pinot Noir and Riesling. And I just intentionally chose to have my pot roast with that dry Riesling from Oregon. And it was delightful. The saltiness of the meat, the savory nature alongside of the fruity side of the Riesling was delicious. I did have some Pinot Noir with it just to see how I liked one or the other. And they were both delicious, all based on, fruitiness and tartness. The other really cool thing about Riesling is, what do the top tier Pinot Noirs cost in the world? What do the top tier Chardonnays in the world cost? What do the top tier Bordeaux blends cost? Yeah, not what Riesling costs. Riesling is one of the, if not the most dollar to what you get value ratio friend of the consumer of any grape you can imagine. The greatest wines of Germany still cost significant percentages less than what you're going to pay out of Bordeaux. The great sweet wines of Germany are less than the greatest Sauterne. The great dry Rieslings of Germany are far less than what you pay out of Burgundy for Chardonnay. And it goes on. And, if you like to age wine, the least expensive large collection of wine you can have that will age significantly is a large collection of Riesling. All these things are positive. TJ, you tracking with me here?
I am. I share your love and passion for Riesling. And I have a question, because I still feel like it's a bit of an insider's wine. Why isn't Riesling more popular with the general consumer?
It's a great question. And I've really kind of noodled on this throughout my career, because I spent a lot of time standing next to tables trying to convince people of trying new things, right? And one of the things that I wanted them to try desperately was Riesling, because I loved it and because I knew it would work with their food. The first obstacle with Riesling is fading now. When I first started selling wine, the idea of Riesling was still tied to Germany, which was still basically abused by the idea of Liebfraumilch being the first wine that a lot of my customers cut their teeth on. They either cut their teeth on that or Mateus Rosé. And so in that regard, both that generation had a bad view of pink wine, and they had a bad view of things that they thought were German or Riesling, because they thought that they had grown up and therefore now drank dry reds or dry whites from California or whatever it was. And so the first obstacle for me in their regard was to get them to realize that not all Riesling was fruity style or residual sugar style. And I was successful in changing some minds along the way for people who admitted to me they liked some Sauvignon Blanc, either from New Zealand or Sancerre. Those people I could turn on to dry Riesling, and they would go, "Wow, I didn't know it tasted like that," and they would get into it. Some people, it was never successful. They just had too much of a barrier. And I would say if there's a barrier that's more modern than that, because that barrier is slipping away, the current barrier is that the electric tartness of Riesling across its spectrum is hard for a lot of people to take. They're used to softer, friendlier, less direct styles of wine. If they're drinking Chardonnays, you just don't get that kind of razor's edge from Chardonnay, even out of Chablis, right? If they're used to drinking Pinot Grigio, this is a world apart. Pinot Grigio is about as friendly as white wine gets, to the point of almost not having a personality, depending on which one you're drinking. And so that is the barrier to me for Riesling in the modern world, is getting people used to the idea of tartness and helping them embrace it. And the only way that I am normally successful with this is making sure I'm keeping it in context of food, which we're going to talk about in a few minutes, where we say, all right, what should we eat and drink together to make Riesling and or Grüner Veltliner a magical choice? How do you feel about that explanation?
Yeah, that makes sense to me. And I think I'm interested to see about food pairing, because I think that's another challenge, is people, for some reason, I don't know why, maybe you'll elaborate on this, Riesling seems to throw people for a loop with food pairing.
Yeah, I think it does, because they underestimate it. The idea that, well, Riesling is lightweight, so I can't pair it with serious food. Well, quite the contrary. And I'll give an example of that here in a minute. But Great Expectations, I think that what often happens when we want to introduce people to wines, and this is super important for all of you out there in the audience who are in the restaurant game or are even selling to restaurateurs who don't have, you're not selling to an experienced buyer, you're selling to the next buyer up, for lack of a better description. They got the job because somebody left, and everybody thinks putting the wine list together is easier than it really is. And they just give it to the next person who's willing, which I was very grateful at one point that was me. But it doesn't always give us the greatest opportunity as salespeople, is to make sure that people have proper expectations going into trying a wine. Because here's a great example, TJ. So if I'm trying to introduce this wine to someone whose favorite grape is Chardonnay, and I find out that they like a style of Chardonnay, to them, when they look at a glass of white wine and they are about to put some of it in their mouth, their brain is going to default to the idea of what Chardonnay tastes like, because that is their favorite flavor that ends up with wine without a whole lot of color in it, right? So if I give them the glass of wine and go, hey, what do you think about this? And I give them zero expectations, it's going to be so far afield from what the expectation was going in set by their brain that it's almost impossible for them to like it. It's I often make this comparison, like you go out to dinner one night and before you ever left the house, you're like, you know what? Haven't had a good steak in a long time. I never get them right on the grill myself. I want to put it in the hands of a professional. I am having a steak tonight. And your palate and your brain and your mood is all set on the idea of I'm going to have a steak. Well, you get to the restaurant and they have a steak on the menu, but you can tell that it's not necessarily their focal point for the restaurant. It's not a steak restaurant. It's a across the board restaurant. And the server is so good at talking about, the fish dish of the night, this absolutely amazing sounding fish dish. And he talks you into it, or she talks you into it. And you think, well, I can have steak some other time. They come back to check on you after you've tried this that they're so excited about. And very often your reaction is going to be, yeah, it's pretty good. And, they're sort of crestfallen. You leave going, dinner was okay. All of that was because when you got there, you wanted a steak and somebody gave you something else, even if you agreed to it, and you weren't ready for it. The same thing happens with wine every time. If I try to sell somebody a different grape than they think is normal for that flavor profile, white wine, red wine, etc., and I don't get them on board with me to make sure they understand what's coming, then I'm going to fail with that introduction. Sort of like, how many of us, when we want to meet, we want to take one of our friends and we want to create a friends group of sorts because we think that friend and our other friend would really get along well together. How many times do we just throw them in the room and tell neither of them anything about the other? We make pre-introductions, right? We talk to John about James and James about John, and then we put them together so that they feel like at least they have something to know about the other person to start a conversation. Does that make sense, TJ?
Yeah, well, that's really interesting. I have sort of a follow-up question on that, because I was taught, I don't know if taught's the right word, but it's sort of common wisdom, don't tell people what they're going to taste, let them discover it. But I completely agree with you and I understand your point. So I assume maybe you'll talk about it now. How do you set the expectations without completely telling them, here's everything you're going to taste?
Right. That's the key. Don't tell them too much because that's overwhelming to the average consumer, right? Because, if I start to list, and let me preface this with, this is not because I'm feeling like I can describe a glass of wine with everything that's in there, because nobody can. There are thousands of esters in a glass of wine, and I might come up with 7. Okay, well, that's just not that many. So let's not be too prideful about it. But the 7 that I come up with is 4 more than the average person I'm talking to, or 7 more than the average person I'm talking to, who normally it comes up with, I like it, I don't like it, and can't tell you why. Okay, so let's put ourselves in their shoes. We need to make them comfortable. All right. So if I bring a Riesling to the table and I'm like, hey, I'd really love you to try this wine. I know you happen to like, because we had this conversation and you said, hey, I like Sancerre, or I like Sauvignon Blanc from New Zealand. And I'm thinking, well, that's great. If you like Sauvignon Blanc from New Zealand, I can introduce you to something new that you'll love. Are you willing to try it? Sure. Okay, great. And I bring back a bottle of Eden Valley Riesling, right? New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc, Eden Valley Riesling, intensity level matches. Some of the fruits match. We might be successful here. And I give them no descriptions other than I think you'll like this. they're going to expect the wine I'm bringing to taste exactly what they think New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc tastes like. So I need to alter that a little bit. And I say something like, New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc shows a lot of grapefruit. This wine is going to show a lot of lime. New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc shows a lot of really bright green herbal side. This one's going to be, there's some herbs there, but it's subtle. So don't expect that vegetation herbal bite that you like. New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc shows some passion fruit. This wine does too. New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc is about middle weight, maybe a little richer than middle weight, and this one's solid on the middle. New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc is refreshing, makes your mouth water. So does this one. And both wines are dry. And then I leave it at that. But in order to do that, we have to have a lexicon in our own head of all the things that we can describe Riesling with. And so here's a classic set of visual lexicon, right? It's very common to see orange, tangerine, lemon, kumquat, lime. Lime is the driver of the citrus for Riesling, but these others come along depending on the region. There will almost, in the old world especially, you'll come across some sort of yeasty, leesy, creme fraiche, perhaps even note, depending on how it was fermented. New world, not so much. Passion fruit is a very common descriptor for riper styles of Riesling. I find it in Australian Riesling. I find it in some of the particular soil types in Germany as well, and occasionally in Austria. And the other thing I want people to understand is this little picture on the bottom left, where you have this neon green in the middle of a dark room. Riesling, to the average person who's never tried it, hits them like that. It's like, whoa, what was that? Because imagine if I put in colored lights on a black background for the way Chardonnay hits you. TJ, what color and intensity do you think would be Chardonnay? I hadn't prepped you for that. This is going to be totally off the top of your head.
A little softer boundaries and more yellow to me. A little rounder.
Yeah. Okay. So how about Pinot Grigio?
Lighter, like a light pale green.
And really broad, so that it's sort of like, it's really subtle, like almost shadows across the black, right? Mm-hmm. Because the wine's so subtle. So we have to prep people for the intensity level of Riesling. And, Sauvignon Blanc from New Zealand to dry Riesling, that's an easy transition because they're both in your face, right? But if you're taking somebody from, crisp, refreshing European Chardonnay into richer, bolder Riesling, then you've got to make some sort of connection for them. And then the other thing is talking to people about sugar content and its place in beverages, right? So don't try to describe minerality to a guest, but do realize that Riesling carries it in spades, and often from places that you wouldn't think it's going to have it. Like, I find minerality in Australian Riesling. Is it yeast source? Is it just the nature of the grape? There's a lot of arguments for that, but it's not void, right? So where do we go with sugar in a world where wine drinkers are afraid to accept sugar because they think it makes them not serious wine drinkers? Explain it like I explained it earlier. Just ask them, do you like water? Yes. Do you like a lot of lemon in water? Not so much. How about a lot of lemon, water, and some sugar? And they start to smile because they know you just brought up lemonade. And you just explain it from the reality that some beverages just aren't complete without a little sweetness. And many Rieslings, because of the way they're made and where they're from, the magic is the balance of the tart and the sweet, and then pair it with food. Are we cool?
Do people still have, we're going back some time when I was still in restaurants, and there was a lot of misunderstanding about the use of the term dry. Is that still the case?
Yeah, totally. Fruity and sweet is synonymous in the consumer's mind, but it's not in ours. So make sure you're using terminology that makes sense for them. So when you say dry to someone, they probably are thinking about the effect on them, not the technical definition. So Chardonnay is drying and Riesling is not, right? Riesling is very mouthwatering. So I would tend towards terminology that was more about the experience. This wine will dry your mouth out. This wine's going to make your mouth water. This wine's going to give you a, texture, round, lean, zippy, fresh, crisp, things that they can have some sort of reference to, because the technical data of wine, it makes sense to us because we're inundated with it and we use it with each other. It really doesn't make sense to the consumer.
Makes sense.
Yeah, it's jargon, right? We got to change our jargon to match theirs. Zippy, Gruner Veltliner. Indeed. Let's talk about some simple truths about Gruner Veltliner. It's one of the more interesting and food-friendly whites. It has a range of style. It fits price, moment, and preference. That's what I love about it. It's not a chameleon because it has its own personality, but it fits a lot of different applications. Notice that I did not say Gruner Veltliner is one of the top 5 greatest white wine or red wine grapes on the planet. I wouldn't say that about it, but man, is it interesting and fun to show people. It offers this unique and earthy herbal note that is absolutely fabulous on the table. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. And the other interesting thing is it's a grape with almost exclusively quality-driven offerings, remarkable value to quality ratio. And what I mean by that, TJ, is that cheap, quote unquote, Gruner Veltliner almost doesn't exist because there's just not enough planted around the world for us to have like the, bulk tank Chardonnay exists all over the place. Bulk Pinot Grigio exists all over the place, but there's very few offerings of, large volume Gruner Veltliner to water down the impression of the grape. For that matter, even over at Trader Joe's, they have one from Hungary that's, I don't know, it's like $4.49 a bottle, but guess what? It still tastes like Gruner Veltliner. It's pretty impressive in that regard. So the important thing with notice I changed the descriptor from great expectations to savory expectations, because when you're bringing Gruner Veltliner into somebody's world, you want to talk to them about the savory elements of the wine, which will be very interesting to them because I doubt they've heard it, right? We think of food as being savory. We don't think of liquids as being savory, but they do exist. And Gruner Veltliner is one of those combination flavor profiles that offers you both the traditional wine fruitiness type stuff, plus this herbal, savory, spicy, earthy thing that is very, very key to actually finding people who love it. All right, so here's a little bit more pictograph of what we can get out of Gruner Veltliner and why it matters. At its most rich, you have that picture on the left where it's a little bit oily, and this would be that Smaragd level out of Vacau, where these wines are 14.5% alcohol. They're coating in the mouthfeel. They're very intensely spicy and savory, and they have this oily texture to them. The down the middle version of Gruner Veltliner is not really that way, but it can be that way. So you should expect tart citrus fruits, usually lime. You'll find some other things wandering around in there. Some people will argue for lemon with Gruner Veltliner. We're all talking very closely to the same idea. And once in a while in a riper style, you'll see that tropical citrus note as you've seen in the picture. What I also like about this wine is and let's talk about the savory stuff really essentially here, because this green lentil sort of effect, some people call it stale beer. Some people call it a few other things, but there's an earthy, legume sort of aroma profile and flavor to Gruner Veltliner, which makes it akin to food because it starts to taste like food. It's far less electric than Riesling, but it still has that bright, refreshing tartness to it. TJ, your MW friend had a great concept for it. It was, I'm losing it. I had it in my mind. Remind me again of how he describes the acid balance of Gruner.
A roller coaster of acidity.
Roller coaster, yeah. It comes up to a peak and then fades off, whereas Riesling acidity just sort of comes up to a plateau and keeps going. It keeps driving the wine, doesn't really fall off at the end. Minerality is common in Gruner Veltliner, but to me, it's about the savory spice combination that's more prevalent. You'll get these yeasty, leesy notes that help bring up the flavor combinations a little bit, like maybe the Pilsner or lager yeast. And that's the part of Gruner Veltliner that makes it very similar in the mind of the consumer to Pinot Grigio, which we're going to talk about in a minute as a way to introduce it. And then this The most charming thing for me, the most attractive thing for me, is the white pepper, some people call it ginger note of Gruner Veltliner. It's spicy. It actually feels like you're adding garnishment to your food while you use it as a beverage alongside your food. And that is what makes it so good with things that it's not, that most wines aren't. So for instance, asparagus, artichokes, ramps, all that green fiddlehead ferns, all those things that are really prominent in the springtime, Gruner Veltliner is your friend. Asparagus just doesn't like very many wines at all. It's very difficult to put on a table and pair well. You definitely need acidity. You definitely need crispness, but that savory element in Gruner Veltliner makes it work with those hard to work with grape food items. All right. So now we're going to put it in their glass and get a thumbs up, we hope. That's the whole point, right? So let's talk about some keys to success for these wines with real everyday people. We've kind of touched on them. And the first one is make accurate and reasonable comparisons. So if I want to sell if I want to sell Gruner Veltliner to a customer, and it's probably the one that I'm serving by the glass, then I'm going to find out if they like things like Pinot Grigio. How do you feel about Pinot Grigio? Oh, I really like that. We drink it all the time. I was like, great. Well, imagine your Pinot Grigio with a little spice added. And they go, oh, that sounds interesting. Then I pour them a glass of Gruner Veltliner, and all of a sudden they're sold. There was a point in time when I was a little more foolish than I am now. And I don't know that I would repeat this experiment, but I probably would. I removed my Pinot Grigio by the glass, replaced it with Stott Krim's Gruner Veltliner, and did that for 2 years straight. And therefore there was no Pinot Grigio by the glass in the restaurant. Now that's a little bit obnoxious, but it worked. And I had one person in 2 years tell me that, no, I'm sorry, I don't like this. I don't want this. So it kind of forced the issue. But in the modern world, now that Gruner Veltliner has a little bit of a foothold, because that was like, I don't know, 12, 13 years ago. So Gruner Veltliner was still barely climbing up the ladder. Now you can have them both, and you can introduce them both. Bold Gruner Veltliner is, I think, you have the potential to work with a Chardonnay and a Viognier customer here. You have to get them beyond the expectation of oak spice and substitute savory spice, which is pretty simple transition. You're talking about, hey, instead of getting that beautiful, cinnamon clove that you get out of Chardonnay barrel aging, what we're going to substitute that with is ginger, white pepper, in a really kind of like seasoning your food way. And then you can alter the food, the fruit source accordingly. And that normally will work if they're willing to spend the money on one of the more bold Gruner Veltliners, or if you happen to be serving it by the glass because you have an extensive glass pour program or what have you. Let's talk about Riesling again, because we alluded to it a little earlier, but I feel like if you're going to make a comparison to someone for dry Riesling, you can easily ask them, do you like Sauvignon Blanc? Yes or no. Do you like Albarino? Yes or no. I've never heard of it, whichever way you want to go with it. But those are the two that are the easiest transitions out of what they drink now and into what I would like to introduce you. Fruity Rieslings is kind of what I talked about earlier. This one, instead of making a comparison to what they already like, I think now we're dealing with, let's compare it to something that we know they drink. We all love lemonade. And I've often asked someone, and would do it without hesitation, hey, do you like margaritas? And if the person says, yeah, I love margaritas, then you can say, well, I have a wine that's going to act like margarita with your food. Because when you take one of these fruity style Rieslings with, a pH of 2.8, 2.9, 3.1 at the maximum, and, 35 grams of residual sugar, that is going to hit their food just like a margarita does. And it will be very similar across their palate, a little racy, a little sweet, a little tangy, and really great textural feel towards the finish. The other thing for bold Gruner Veltliner, if they're an experienced wine consumer and they haven't really delved into Austrian wine before, you can talk about white Bordeaux blends, because there's there's this sort of savory, nutty, oily feel to Bordeaux blends with Semillon in them that is akin to the bolder, Smaragd level Gruner Veltliner that you can get out of Vacau and some of the richer versions of Kamtal Krimstal. But last but not least, these are wines that you're going to be most successful making sure the person is going to put them in the right context. Give them a food and wine pairing suggestion that matters and makes sense and something they can pull off. So if you're in the retail world and you're selling this wine, then maybe have a recipe in mind, or even print it out. Go through the extra effort. Have a couple of recipes for each of these grapes that you're trying to sell that work with it, especially if you happen to be a market/wine shop, and encourage people to go down a path of putting it in the right context with the right food. If you're in a restaurant, it's the easy button, right? Put it with the food that's going to work. And those things are, Riesling's magic because it'll work with just about everything. But if you have a slightly spicy dish, I emphasize slightly, and you want to use a fruity Riesling alongside of it, that's great. Asian flavors like all the soy sauces and the umami-driven dishes, Riesling is magic, especially fruity Riesling because, sugar and salt work great together. That's why we like, chocolate and pretzels and peanut butter and Reese's peanut butter cups. Why they're so good is salty and sweet. And then with Gruner Veltliner, this is the time. Morel mushrooms, asparagus, fiddlehead ferns, all those things make Gruner Veltliner really magical to consume with food, and you'll be successful this way. What do you think, TJ?
Yeah, and one of the things I've always remembered from Wine for Dummies, which is one of my all-time favorite wine books from Mary Ewing Mulligan and her husband Ed McCarthy, is Gruner Veltliner with fried chicken.
Yeah.
I think they call it the ultimate fried chicken wine or something like that.
Yeah, and Riesling's really great with fried chicken too. And the other thing that's, if you live on a coast, Riesling and Gruner Veltliner with oysters and, clams and all of the shellfish, fabulous. Easy button.
And once again, I'm hungry after our pre-shift.
Good thing it's lunch. Good thing we moved this, right? Yes. We moved it so you can just go straight into lunch after I've made you hungry talking about all this foods. And, if you have a question or a comment or any kind of wisdom you'd like to share, now's a great time. We're going to move on to introduce next week's topic.
2 weeks.
2 weeks. Next week is the Bordeaux show. We might as well just tell them.
Yes. Well, next week is the Bordeaux show, of course. Same time, same day. So every Tuesday at 11 a.m. Eastern, join us. But in 2 weeks, on May the 4th. So
May the 4th be with you.
You'll be in costume that day, Ron?
I'm pretty close already, right? I'm in the all black. Just have to put on a mask.
Oh, you're going to the dark side. Okay. So we're gonna go Greek.
We are gonna go Greek. A lot of people who know me well are wondering how I've made it this long without having a serious discussion on pre-shift about Greek wines. I decided to be a little less predictable. I have a love affair with this country and its wines. I think that they're so underrated in our marketplace, but they need help from us because, for someone to look down at a menu and say, yeah, I'll have a bottle of Moscofilero, that's not going to happen very often on its own. Or yes, sure, let's have a Naioritico from Nemea. These are wines that need us to jump in the gap for them. And I think I just expect me to sort of try to translate a little bit of the culture of Greece through its wines to you so that maybe you'll love Greece a little bit more, or maybe half as much as I do, or maybe you already love Greece as much as I do. It's pretty amazing. And I often say that, it's a country I just can't go back to enough. I've been there 3 times and I could go twice a year. There's just something about the country and the people and the wines that I just don't tire of it. It's just wonderful. So come back on May the 4th be with you, and we'll talk about Greek wine.
All right. Thank you all for joining. And we hope to see you again every Tuesday for alternating from the Bordeaux show. And in 2 weeks, on May the 4th, we're going to go Greek.